This is episode 459 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Elizabeth Stelle. She is director of policy analysis at Commonwealth Foundation, a free market think tank based in Pennsylvania, and the sister organization of the Rio Grande Foundation based in Pennsylvania. So welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Interesting election there in Pennsylvania. Before we get into your new report and discussing state labor laws as they pertain to the public sector, where do things stand in Pennsylvania? I think you had a Democrat governor, and is your legislature still Republican dominated?
Yeah, so we had a little bit of a change this year with the midterms. Our previous governor was a Democrat, so the Democrats maintained control of the governor's mansion. But in the legislature, we had a bit of an interesting situation. We were previously controlled in both chambers by Republicans. The Senate majority held, but in the House, it actually came down to just two races to determine control. So the Democrats do technically have control of our House of Representatives. However, there are three vacancies on the Democrat side. So while they have a technical majority, they don't have a functional majority. And even when they are fully staffed up after the special elections that will need to take place, they'll only have a two-person majority. So they're going to have to work together. It's going to be a really interesting session.
That will indeed be interesting. Of course, you famously had the Fetterman versus Dr. Oz U.S. Senate race, which limited in its impact on state level policy, but quite the fascinating train wreck to watch that whole situation unfold.
We had the star factor. I don't think it was to our benefit in terms of people who are concerned about limited government. But that said, I think our new governor is going to be much more hands-on than some of our previous leaders. So it'll be really interesting to see where Pennsylvania goes from here. It's not clear. It's not clear. I guess we'll know a lot more in a couple of months.
Well, New Mexico went from deep blue to deep blue. We had our governor's race up, and there was a lot of optimism that there was going to be a more conservative governor in place. But with the dissipation of the red wave, we went from hopes of just competitiveness, a little bit more split in the power structure, to continuing kind of where we've been for most of the last 90 years, which is a Democrat controlled state. So I give all that, and just wanted to hear where you are there in Pennsylvania, partially because I think it sets the table for what we're going to discuss here in your report, the Commonwealth Foundation. That's commonwealthfoundation.org. The Battle for Worker Freedom in the States, Grading State Public Sector Labor Laws, third edition. Now, I know I had one of the authors, Priya Brannick. I think she got married and changed her last name. So if you put her into Tipping Point, New Mexico website, PRIYA, she was our guest last time you had an edition come out. And just talk about this report and what it attempts to do and where things are going in terms of public sector labor laws across the country.
Sure. Well, this is the premier resource for anybody who is working on labor law at the state level. We do all the dirty work. We comb through all the state statutes and figure out where your state stands on 11 different metrics of worker freedom. And then we compare that across the country and look for trends, try to get a sense of what's changing, what's status quo. What does that mean in terms of people who want to advance worker freedom policies in their state? And I would, take a step back and note that worker freedom, labor policy isn't just about worker freedom. Certainly is. We want all workers to have agency and freedom to associate with who they want to associate with, leave a union, join a union. However, it also has is very critical when you look at spending, what your state government prioritizes on that end, because personnel is obviously one of your largest costs. So how you go about negotiating contracts, finding arbitration, all those technical terms really matters when you're talking about state spending. So there's also that fiscal element that I think is really important. And one of the reasons that we spend the time doing this report, we did it in 17, we did it in 19, and then COVID kind of threw us through a loop. But we're back with our new edition in 22. And we hope to continue doing it because there's some really interesting trends that I don't think are being documented in the media. And if you pay attention at all to labor issues, you probably get this sense that, there's like this blue wave right now. I know Wendy Weingartner and friends over at the American Federation of Teachers is talking about, talking about how, they helped open the schools and, they have a mandate and the unionization of Amazon and Starbucks and, everybody wants to be in the union now. It's kind of the message that they're trying to get across. But when you look at government sector unions, when you look at what's actually happening on the ground in the states, you get a slightly different picture. So it's important to go behind the headlines and see what's actually going on in terms of union membership trends.
Now, your report, it's specifically about public sector unions. Right. That's accurate? So talk about the kind of broad difference between public and private sector. Now, of course, Janus versus AFSCME, U.S. Supreme Court decision, essentially gave right to work status to public sector unions back in 2018. And, so this is the second report to come out since then. But talk briefly about the difference between public and private sector unions and why you specifically study public sector unions.
Yeah, it's a great question. We get that a lot from lawmakers that are trying to understand, because you have your private sector unions, like your Teamsters, your Boilermakers, sort of the traditional blue collar unions that you think of. I'm from Pennsylvania, so steelworkers, is top of the list there. That's private sector. So those individuals are constrained in negotiations by just how the company is doing. If they ask for too much, the company goes under. Unlike those unions, those private sector unions, public sector unions are negotiating with the government, and taxpayers are paying the bill. So it's a very different dynamic. And not every state has collective bargaining for public sector unions. That's one of the things we look at in this report, is grading the states based on who even has collective bargaining for public sector unions. So it's a very different dynamic in the public sector. There's not a natural check on their influence because, taxpayers' money, other people's money, the incentives just are not the same. So we look very carefully at making sure that those public sector unions have, the same playing field, have the same type of rules as other special interests in the state. Because what we've seen is that when those rules are different, they get a lot of special advantages, which in turn erode the worker freedom of the state workers, the teachers, the correction officers, and other individuals that might be unionized.
Now, collective bargaining in and of itself for public sector workers plays a role in your report. It's something that, it seems, I think, to a lot of people who aren't familiar with all these rules and laws, that you're banning collective bargaining, you're banning unionization essentially. But there were some changes outlined in your report involving both the states of Virginia and Arkansas, and they really had some profound impacts on their standing in your report. Talk about whether public sector workers should be able to unionize in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's a controversial question because the incentives are not aligned. We would say that there really doesn't seem to be the same mandate for public sector union as private sector. So we grade very highly the states that do not allow collective bargaining for their public sector workers. So that's why in this most recent report, Arkansas, for example, jumped from a C to an A plus because they passed a law that comprehensively restricts that collective bargaining ability. Virginia did the opposite. They allowed collective bargaining on the local government level for the first time. So they dropped from an A plus to a C. Again, when you put the government in charge of negotiating with unions, what you end up is unions negotiating against themselves. And I'll give you an example from Pennsylvania. Here, the unions have spent over $185 million on politics since 2007. They are, the largest political donor in our state. They have tremendous influence and power. So what they do is, they fund the campaigns of the governors, and then when the governors get elected, they're negotiating with their funders. So it creates this very perverse set of incentives. And we think, there are other ways that you can go about constructing good civil servants, collective bargaining. What that ends up doing is really just siphonning funds from workers into politics that they may or may not even support. And, that's a whole other conversation, but it's quite opaque. There's not a lot of transparency. And that's, again, why we do this study to look at the labor laws, because a lot of people just don't realize how their money is being utilized. They don't realize the rights they don't have, or aren't telling them, the rights that they have as a worker.
Now, famously, at least within free market circles, Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not support the idea of public sector unionization. Now, I don't know if he were alive today what his position would be, but at the time when he was president, he certainly wrote about that as an issue. And I, feel free to comment on that in any way you want. But more importantly, while private sector unions tend to, at least their membership tends to be fluid in their political allegiances, the union bosses tend to be, adjuncts of the Democratic Party. But talk about the political activities of those government employee unions and why they're so harmful to kind of basic free market public policy.
Well, I'll give you one example of a measure we look at, and we call this paycheck protection before COVID, not paycheck protection that we think about today. This is the idea that public employees, have their unions automatically withdrawn out of their paycheck. And they can also check a little box to say that they also would like to contribute to the PAC, the Political Action Committee. So what that does is create sort of a barrier between the union member and the union. They don't really see how much money is going to the union. They kind of forget about it. And also you have government, which is functionally collecting political money for a political entity. So, if I went to the state government and said, hey, can you put a little box on your employees' forms for me, and so they can just check it if they want to donate $20 to the Commonwealth Foundation, that would be outrageous. You would say, no, you can't use government resources to fund a private entity. But that's exactly what we're doing with these government sector unions. So that's one example of how these special privileges raise not just questions about worker freedom, but also serious ethical questions about where do you draw the line between government and special interests. The reforms that we're seeing happen after Janus, they're very piecemeal. They're kind of, case by case. They're not as splashy as the Supreme Court case, but they're making a significant difference. And so a report really tries to get into that and say, okay, where are the incremental gains? Where are the incremental losses? We mentioned Virginia already. And what does that mean going forward? Because good labor reform looks different in every state, depending on your state laws as they currently exist, depending on the political environment, depending on the size and scope of the political machine for the government unions in that state.
Yeah. Now, so we talked about collective bargaining in and of itself, which that kind of is a yes, no. How many states don't do collective bargaining? Do you know for government employees?
we're pretty low on that. I think we're down to 3, but I will pull
Okay.
up the report, because the report, what we did in the report, is we have a table at the end where people can look up their state and all the different, how they rank on all the different measures. But then we also have an online tool where you can go and see, what grade New Mexico is a D, for instance, and then you can compare that to other
D
states.
minus.
A D, yeah, D minus. Sorry, we're a D, you're a D minus, so I guess we have a little bit up on you, but not much. And that's because a couple of years ago, New Mexico decided to ban local right to work. So each of those grades and the pluses and the minuses are correlated with particular policies that ebb and flow over the years.
So, okay. So looking at your report, the A plus states, it says these states prohibit collective bargaining for some or all classes of government workers. There's 7 states, Texas,
Yeah.
Arkansas, Indiana, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Virginia used to be a state that did not have collective bargaining, but recently they switched, and Arkansas, as you report, you said in your report, they eliminated collective bargaining. So interesting stuff. Okay, so once we get past that kind of, it's pretty simple. If you don't have collective bargaining, you are hiring, government employees and having them work relatively free of the impact of politics, which is the way it should be. Where do we go next from there? What are the states that have some of the better laws in place relating to public employee unions, and what are those specific laws?
Well, I want to highlight Wisconsin here. They are an A on our ranking. But what Wisconsin does, which I think is really important if you're in a state that has collective bargaining for public sector workers, they have a process for recertification. So right now in Pennsylvania and many other states, once the union is certified, it goes on forever. So we're at the point now where I think there's one union in our state that has a few of the original voting members. Every other union, those people are retired, they've passed away, they're long gone. So the people in those unions now have never actually voted to be represented by that union, which means that if another union came along and said, hey, I can represent you guys better, that process is extremely difficult. Or if the group of workers decides that they no longer want to be unionized, decertifying that union is extremely difficult. Creating a regular pathway for recertification means they would have to vote it depends, 2, 4, 6 years on whether they still want, for example, the NEA affiliate to represent the teachers in a district, or the SEIU affiliate to represent workers in a government agency. What that does is empower workers, and it also creates a lot of accountability for the union, because the union knows that, hey, we have to serve these people. We can't just shrug off their grievances. We can't, ignore their requests, because if we do, they might vote us out. They might vote another union, or they might, decide to end unionization altogether. So that really empowers workers, and it really kind of keeps in check the worst actors in this space. And in Wisconsin, that was a tremendous part of the reforms that they were able to integrate, and the reason why they went from budget deficits to budget surpluses.
Good to know. Yeah. They are an A in the report alongside Iowa, and that's laudable for a lot of those policies. So you put in 8 states in the B category: Alabama, Arizona, Idaho, Kentucky, Michigan, Mississippi, North Dakota, and West Virginia. What is it that these states do generally well?
These states are an interesting category, because you think, oh, they're right to work, they're good. Well, no, again, we're talking about private sector, not, or we're not talking just about private sector, we're talking about public sector too. But also some of their rules are written very well, and some of their labor laws are just non-existent. And so what that does is give unions the ability to write things into contracts that might not be worker friendly. So you have a mixed bag here of states that have either good laws on the books or just don't have a law at all about a certain provision that we grade them on. So that's why you get a smattering of states, like Alabama, Michigan is in here in C grade. It's a bit of a mixed bucket. Whereas once you get into the C category, these are the states that have some pretty severe restrictions on worker freedom, and then it goes down from there. But just because you have right to work doesn't mean that your state is a great place for worker freedom. So I just want to reiterate that. Again, we're talking about public sector workers, but also there's a lot more that goes into it than just whether you do or do not have collective bargaining.
All right. And these states, so I guess it would sound like they should clarify, just pass laws clarifying their rules on unionization and what the unions can negotiate. And that's something that everybody can do, I believe. Obviously here in New Mexico, probably in Pennsylvania, it's a real big push for legislatures RD mixed to eliminate collective bargaining. It can be done, but it's a big push. But just clarifying what can and cannot be negotiated seems like a good thing for people who genuinely care about good government to embark upon.
Something else that's really good for states like New Mexico that are, still trying to educate people on why worker freedom is important and how those workers are constrained in their state is transparency laws. We're a lot of times contracts will have provisions, or actually this is actually a recent trend with Virginia especially, where they will in the contract say that they have unlimited access to workers' personal information. So they can get your mailing address, your home number, your cell phone number, all of your personal information. And then what that turns into is you get inundated with mailers or phone calls, and people sometimes aren't necessarily intimidated, but just are tired of being contacted. And so they'll go along with, maybe, joining a union or making a donation or something like that. So privacy laws are kind of a nice place to start in terms of just making sure that the union workers understand what their union is actually doing, how they're actually spending their money. That can go a long way in terms of education and beginning to change a culture.
Now, as I read through this, I see that the C grade applies to states that just have more generous provisions within their labor regulations regarding public sector unions. And I think the interesting thing is that there are some right to work and forced unionism states that fall into this category. You think of Florida, especially after this recent election, as being a deep red state. Well, it sounds like Ron DeSantis and his crew might have some room to run here in terms of labor regulations. Don't know if you've heard anything out of Florida, or that's something that's on his priority list, but Colorado, Florida, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Nebraska, Nevada, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Utah, Virginia, and Wyoming. So, a lot of red states, some purple states, and even, let's see, I don't see any overtly blue states, although Nevada is very dark purple, so to speak. So talk about some of these grades, and especially, how you could see a Florida or a Colorado improving.
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example of Florida. They score a C. For example, strikes for public sector workers are illegal, but they do not have paycheck protection. So they're a mixed bag. They do have pretty expansive collective bargaining. So depending on what part of government you're in, you can negotiate on your salary, your benefits, your hours, your work conditions. That's pretty expansive. So, maybe it's a question of narrowing, what collective bargaining focuses on in Florida and states like that. Colorado has actually been moving the other way. Not enough to change their grade, but they did have a functional union in place, and they made that official for their state workers and their county workers. So they are moving towards more collective bargaining. And it's been a very slow process with Colorado, which I think is sort of a model that we are seeing play out in states. They start with these these non-binding agreements with the government, and then eventually they move into a fully recognized collective bargaining unit that is affiliated with one of the nationals. So that's more, I think, of a cautionary tale when you're looking at what happened in Colorado. And in our report, we talk about them along with Virginia in terms of states where we saw some setbacks over the past 2 years.
Yeah, Colorado's unique example because Colorado, it does have on the fiscal side a taxpayer's bill of rights that's very robust and limits state spending, but it's a state that in recent years especially has moved as far to the liberal progressive blue state dynamic as any other state in the country. And it's of course a neighbor of New Mexico, a state that in general kicks us all over the field in terms of economic performance and population growth and education reform, education policy and performance. So any other states that you want to specifically discuss? South Dakota is another one that kind of sticks out because that's certainly a red state. And, Kristi Noem, like Ron DeSantis, is somebody with a national profile there. It would seem that it would behoove a Kristi Noem to, take on some of these labor issues.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Florida, it's more that these aren't controversial issues, so they haven't really made it a priority to tighten up their language and be more explicit about what you can and cannot collective bargain over, and also make clear, what is beyond the power of collective bargaining agreements in terms of things like personal information, defining compensation. That was another thing that they did in Colorado, is they articulated, I think it was 8 different categories of compensation or elements that they could collective bargain over. So they're getting rid of these gray areas, and they're putting in place very specific, expansive language that's going to be very difficult to remove in the future. So, I think that behooves states on the other side to say, okay, well, we're going to do the same. We're going to put in place very clear, specific language that limits what we can do with collective bargaining, that clarifies what happens when there's an impasse, that prevents these disputes from going to an arbitrator who is often more biased towards the unions, than the government entity. So I think there's a lot of, learn that lesson and flip it on its head for states that have a political landscape where some of these reforms are much more viable. I do want to kind of note the cautionary tale of Missouri. This one was a long time coming. We thought it would go this way, for a couple of years. We had to wait till the litigation played out. They had a comprehensive suite of reforms and some of the best labor reforms in the nation, but they were eventually overturned by their Supreme Court. So this just, in Ohio is kind of a similar, if you think, years back to what Ohio tried to do through their ballot measures. It's really critical that states who want to take on worker freedom make sure that they tell the story of the worker and how the worker is being inhibited by these rules, because it has to be about those people. Everybody, agrees that union executives, you can't really trust them. They're elitist. That kind of sense is very pervasive across the country. But you have to make it about how it helps the worker in order to have substantial, or in order to have a win that's going to survive a legal challenge or a ballot initiative. So that's, I think, kind of one of the big lessons that we've learned after Janus, is that you really have to concentrate on worker freedom and making sure that you tell those stories of the workers to get these, legislative reforms written and passed in legislators that, might not be very friendly to the concept of a smaller footprint for public sector unions. One last thing I do want to note for our listeners about trends is litigation. This isn't a comprehensive report on litigation, but we do bring in some trends on litigation this year because there's been a lot of worker freedoms regained through litigation, not necessarily changes in the law yet. But for people's lived experience, things are better. In Pennsylvania, we freed about half of our state workers from restrictions on when they can leave a union. So now they can leave a union whenever they want. used to be like once every 4 years in a 15-day period, be a certified mail. All these hoops to jump through is almost impossible.
Got it.
So what's
That's good.
happening in litigation is really important too.
Now, and we're both here in states that are relatively blue, although Pennsylvania's at least got recent memory of being a more red dominated state. It would seem to me that in a state like Ohio, and I'm actually born and raised in Ohio. I've been in New Mexico for over 16 years though now, and so I follow what happened in Ohio. And that's a Republican governor state, Republican legislature state, and has been for years. You got Montana on this list of D states as well. But in general, correct me if I'm wrong, but when it comes to public sector unions, this seems like something that fits into the good policy and good politics kind of framework, because you're defanging some of your most well-funded and harshest enemies. If you're not taking on the public sector unions as a Republican in a Republican-led state, you're really continuing to fund people who are dedicated completely to de-electing you and getting you out of office. So it seems like something that really makes a lot of sense to do in red states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would point out that we don't get involved in the elections, and we're not out there saying that these reforms, like you said, they're good policy, but they're also beneficial in politics if your concern is limited government. Because what do these entities want to do? Expand the scope of government so they can have more workers, so they can have more dues, so they can have more political influence, and the cycle continues. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense to take a look at your state labor laws if you are in a state where you can do some good reform and just articulate, what is on the books. If we had had someone, pushing the other side in the 50s when a lot of our labor laws went on the books, Pennsylvania would probably be in a very different position. We're a little unique in the sense that we have a lot of these restraints on worker freedom actually written into our laws, where most places they're just in the contracts, right? And that's a much heavier lift, and that's the reason why in Pennsylvania we've done a lot of litigation to at least establish some precedent that we can build on as we move, hopefully, to the area of changing good laws. But, I will know, I think some people expected a much more dramatic shift in the labor landscape after the Janus decision. I think some people are kind of like, well, I thought everyone was going to leave the labor unions. What happened? When you actually look at the numbers, the major unions, the four major unions, your AFSCME, your SEIU, NEA, and AFT, they've lost over 219,000 members. That's not the fee payers, it's just like a different category. These are just people who used to belong to the union as full union members and have since left, or people who, have joined these government entities and have chosen not to join the union. So the actual size, we are seeing a very slow decline in the size of these major unions. And I think that's because people are a little skeptical, especially after COVID. What do teacher unions actually stand for? Do they stand for the kids, or do they stand, for themselves? So I think, that message is beginning to seep through. But again, I just, would encourage folks to look at, the worker freedom angle and talk about how, these folks deserve the same freedoms as other workers, and that too often, these union entities are using their special privileges in ways that are, just extremely political and, questionably ethically, to the point that union members don't even know. They don't even know what their money is supporting.
Well, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk at some length about New Mexico. Now, as a blue state, we rank D- in your report, which is not as bad as Maryland, California, Oregon, and Washington. Those are the only F states. So what saves New Mexico from being an F? And given the challenging political climate, is there any way you see that we could move the needle in a more pro labor freedom direction, or do we just need a better a better group of elected officials in New Mexico to try to change things?
Well, I mean, there's two things. There's probably more, but on a quick read, I was looking through this. You're not New York in some of the worst states because your car check is optional and not mandatory. So that's one silver lining there. So chipping away at how union elections are conducted is one thing. The other thing I'd point to is release time. I believe in New Mexico that's written into contracts and not into state law. So one, preventing that from being written into state law is important. And then secondly, looking to reform to proactively, implement a good release time law that prohibits it or significantly restricts it. We talk about what Arizona did in the report this year, how they have the first law in the nation to restrict release time. It's not a complete ban on release time, but it's a good step in the right direction. But just make sure that taxpayers aren't paying for a state worker to be doing union work, right? I mean, they're hired to do work for the people, not to do work for the union. So it's a pretty basic, simple reform in terms of messaging. And also, I think is, really relevant in the Southwest because you do have that example of Arizona. And I'd also note that even if you're in a state that doesn't have a lot of issues with worker freedom now, that doesn't mean you won't have that issue someday. Virginia, but there are many others where we're even seeing some murmurings in North Carolina, which is a state that has a complete ban on collective bargaining, about where they might try to open up that state. So it's coming. And that's why it's important to get the labor laws in your state right, clear, specific, articulate as much as you can.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time. And, the report is available through the Commonwealth Foundation, commonwealthfoundation.org. I'll also put it in the show notes for this show. Any last thoughts before I let you go, Elizabeth?
I just want to encourage people, if you've never thought about labor law, take a look at it, see where your state ranks, because it impacts a lot more than just your workers. It impacts your bottom line, it impacts your spending. And I would say, too, big connection between the power of your labor unions and your education policies, right? That's probably a whole other podcast, but it undergirds everything. So it's worth taking a look at it. If anyone has questions about what reform they can do in their state, Commonwealth Foundation is always happy to give you our legislative language and anything else we can do.
Well, you're in luck because this is episode 459. So for approximately the last 458 episodes, we've had something to say about education policy. So I think people can look into the archives there and see the very real issue that New Mexico faces when it comes to its educational outcomes. But I appreciate your time, Elizabeth. And thanks again to everybody at the Commonwealth Foundation for this great report. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.